I keep coming back to one stone, a single T-shaped limestone pillar standing in the hills above Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than writing itself. UNESCO dates the site around it, Göbekli Tepe, to the 10th and 9th millennia BCE, raised by hunter-gatherers who had no permanent homes, no metal tools, no wheel, no writing of any kind. And yet they organised enough to quarry, carve and raise pillars taller than a person into deliberate ritual enclosures. Then just as quietly as they appeared, the builders vanished. No name, no explanation, only stone and the start of a broken trail. For nearly 20 years after its discovery, I think Göbekli Tepe stood as something almost too convenient to question. One impossible site in an empty landscape, with no explanation for how it got there, or whether anything like it existed anywhere else. That's the version of the story I grew up reading. It isn't the whole story. Here's what I actually know and what I want to build from. UNESCO describes Göbekli Tepe as pre-pottery Neolithic monumental architecture, dated to the 10th and 9th millennia BCE, roughly 11 to 12,000 years ago, before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before the wheel, before anyone on Earth was farming a single crop. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers, not settled villagers, not a kingdom with surplus grain and a labour class. People who moved seasonally, following game and wild plants, who still found the organisation and shared belief required to quarry, carve and raise limestone pillars weighing up to 10 tons. The pillars are T-shaped, some carved with foxes, boars, snakes and birds in detailed relief, arranged in circular and oval enclosures that German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations there from 1995 until his death in 2014, interpreted as ritual space rather than ordinary settlement. No hearths consistent with permanent habitation, no domesticated grain, just stone, symbol, and apparently purpose. For most of the time since excavation began, I'll admit, Göbekli Tepe was treated as exactly that in the textbooks, an outlier. A single, brilliant exception that didn't fit the rest of the timeline, explained away as an unusual but isolated achievement of an otherwise unremarkable hunter-gatherer world. That framing held for decades. It's no longer accurate. Go back to the discovery itself, and it gets stranger before it gets clearer. A German-Turkish survey team first noted the mound at Göbekli Tepe in 1963 and dismissed it. They assumed the broken limestone slabs scattered across the hilltop were medieval grave markers, nothing worth a serious excavation. It sat untouched for another 30 years. It wasn't until 1994 that Klaus Schmidt walked the same hill, recognised the slabs for what they actually were, and began the dig that would eventually push the known timeline of monumental human construction back further than almost anyone in the field was prepared to argue for. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the fill layers confirmed what the architecture already suggested. This site predated farming, predated pottery, predated the wheel, by a margin wide enough that early publications were met with open skepticism before the data settled the argument. So what changed? Why did an isolated miracle become, within 2 decades, the entry point into something much larger? About 9 miles southeast of Göbekli Tepe lies Karahan Tepe, first identified in 1997 during a survey, but not seriously excavated until 2019, when work intensified under what's now called the Taş Tepeler project, a coordinated regional research initiative covering multiple Neolithic sites across Şanlıurfa. Karahan Tepe isn't a smaller copy of Göbekli Tepe. It has its own architecture, rock-cut benches, pillars carved directly from bedrock, and in one structure, a row of phallus-shaped pillars facing a carved human head emerging from the wall, eyes fixed forward, as if watching whatever ritual once took place in front of it. That detail matters more than it first appears. It tells us this wasn't one group building one monument and then disappearing. It was a shared visual language, repeated, consistent, intentional, expressed independently at more than one location, by people who weren't simply imitating a famous neighbour, but who shared a belief system precise enough to produce its own recognisable, symbolic grammar. And Karahan Tepe is not alone either. The Taş Tepeler project, launched formally in 2021 under Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism, names 11 known mounds across the Şanlıurfa region, believed to belong to the same horizon, sites far less familiar than Göbekli Tepe. Sayburç, where a carved scene appears to show a man flanked by two leopards, only properly published in 2021. Sefer Tepe, Yeni Mahala, and others still being surveyed. Most remain largely unexcavated, known mainly from surface surveys and ground-penetrating radar, which means the actual scale of this builder culture is still, by the project's own framing, an open question rather than a settled count. What keeps surfacing site after site is the same visual grammar repeating itself with just enough variation to suggest shared belief rather than simple copying. T-shaped pillars standing in for something, possibly ancestors, possibly something else entirely. Predatory animals carved in relief, recurring across sites miles apart, built by people with no writing system to coordinate the design choices between them. Whatever held that consistency together wasn't a blueprint passed hand to hand. It was memory, transmitted person to person, accurately enough to survive in stone for centuries. So here is where I think the real question has to be asked. If this was a builder culture, organised, deliberate, spread across a region, consistent enough in its symbolism to be recognisable site to site, shouldn't it have left some trace of who it understood itself to be? A name, a title, a story that eventually got written into something readable, 11 mounds, a shared symbolic language, centuries of continuity, and not one signature. That last detail is the one that won't leave me alone. A culture capable of organising labour, transmitting symbolic knowledge accurately across sites, and maintaining that consistency for generations. And yet, they left no name. Not a signature carved into stone, not a title, not a single word we can read, because writing itself was still thousands of years away. We can map where they built, we can describe what they carved, we can date the layers with increasing precision as excavation continues at Karahan Tepe and across the wider Taş Tepeler landscape. What we cannot do with anything found so far is say who these people understood themselves to be, or where they believed they came from, or where eventually this broken trail leads. I keep returning to that gap because it doesn't behave the way gaps in the archaeological record usually behave. Most silences in prehistory are silences of scarcity. Too few sites, too little excavation, too much time for organic material to decay before anyone could study it. This silence is different. We have the sites, we have the carvings, we have a project actively, methodically expanding the count year by year. What we don't have, and may never have, is the one thing writing would have given us automatically, a name attached to any of it. That isn't a gap waiting to be filled by a lucky find next season. It may simply be the shape of what happens to a culture that built monuments before it had any way to label them. The silence, once I started looking for it, has a shape. It doesn't arrive all at once the way a fire or a flood would arrive. It thins out site by site, layer by layer, over a span of time wide enough that no single generation would have experienced it as an ending. I want to start with Göbekli Tepe itself, where the stratigraphy tells its own story. The oldest enclosures, what excavators call Layer 3, date to roughly 9,500 BCE. Massive pillars, elaborate carving, enormous communal effort. The layer above it, Layer 2, is different. Smaller pillars, less elaborate carving, simpler enclosures, sometimes barely larger than a single room. By the time activity at the site winds down, somewhere around 8,000 BCE, the monumental ambition visible in the earliest construction has visibly faded. The site isn't destroyed, it isn't abandoned in a single dramatic episode. It simply gets smaller, quieter, less ornate, generation after generation, until the building stops. And then comes the detail that, I'll be honest, unsettled me the first time I read it closely. Many of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe weren't left to collapse naturally. They were deliberately filled in, packed with rubble, broken stone tools and soil in what looks less like neglect and more like a ritual act of closure. Some excavators describe it as backfilling. Whatever the correct term, the effect is the same. Someone made the choice to bury what their predecessors had built, rather than let it weather away on its own, rather than build on top of it, rather than simply walk away. The labour required to fill a structure that size with rubble and soil by hand isn't trivial. Whoever did it wasn't being careless. They were finishing something, deliberately, on their own terms. So was this collapse, or closure, neglect, or ritual? I think the honest answer is that we can't fully separate those possibilities yet, but the pattern, repeated across so many enclosures, leans toward intention. This is where the timeline becomes genuinely strange rather than simply old. The backfilling didn't happen once, in a single, coordinated event. It happened repeatedly, enclosure by enclosure, across what may have been centuries, which means it wasn't a single generation's decision to close the site. It was a practice, inherited, repeated, apparently understood by each successive group of builders as the correct way to retire a structure once its purpose had been served. A practice maintained across generations is not an accident. It's a tradition, and it's a tradition that, as far as the evidence currently shows, has no successor. The standard explanation for the broader decline is the regional shift toward agriculture and permanent village life, the same Neolithic transition that, not far from these sites, was producing some of the earliest domesticated wheat varieties anywhere on Earth. Once people settle into farming villages, the argument goes, the kind of seasonal, large-scale ritual gathering that built Göbekli Tepe simply stops making sense. That explanation is reasonable, it's also incomplete. A shift toward farming explains why people might gradually stop building enormous T-pillar enclosures from scratch. It doesn't explain why they chose, specifically, to bury the ones that already existed, methodically, repeatedly, generation after generation, rather than ignore them, repurpose them, or build something new directly on top in the same symbolic language. Cultures that evolve their practices over time usually leave a visible line of continuity, a simplified descendant tradition, something a later visitor could point to and say, this clearly grew out of that. Here, I can't find that line. The grammar doesn't simplify into something new, it stops. By the time the broader region enters what archaeologists call the Halaf period, roughly 2,000 years after Göbekli Tepe's final layers, the material culture looks almost unrecognizable next to what came before. Painted pottery, different settlement patterns, different burial customs, nothing in it that obviously descends from T-shaped pillars or deliberately backfilled ritual enclosures. If a thread connects the builder culture to what eventually grew up in its place, it isn't visible in the pottery, the architecture, or the burial customs. It would have to survive somewhere else, if it survived at all. The same pattern repeats across the wider Taş Tepeler network, as far as the currently excavated evidence shows. Karahan Tepe's most elaborate carved chambers belong to its earlier occupation phases. Later activity is sparser, smaller in scale. Seibert shows a similar narrowing over time. None of the 11 mounds, as far as current excavation has revealed, shows a later phase that expands on the T-pillar tradition rather than retreating from it. What comes after, in the centuries that follow, is recognizably different. Later Neolithic and Chalcolithic communities in the same landscape built differently, buried their dead differently, decorated their pottery with motifs that owe nothing obvious to the foxes, boars and leopards carved into the earlier pillars. No later culture claims the T-shaped pillar as its own. No successor tradition inherits the vocabulary. It isn't refined into something new. It isn't preserved as a sacred relic. It simply stops being used, anywhere, by anyone whose remains we've found. So the question shifts, and I think this is the real hinge of the whole investigation. It's no longer only who built this. It's what happened to the people who carried this specific set of beliefs once the building stopped. Where did they scatter? What did they become? Did the knowledge that produced those carvings get lost outright, or did it simply stop being expressed in a form stone could preserve? Beliefs don't vanish as easily as buildings do. People carry them in memory long after the architecture that once housed them has been put back into the earth. Something was buried at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe besides rubble and soil. Whatever it was, it didn't surface again in this region, in any form I've yet found, for thousands of years, which is exactly where this broken trail goes cold. I keep asking myself what kind of culture buries its own cathedral, over and over, across generations, without ever once leaving a record of why. Was it grief? Was it gratitude? Was it simply the correct, expected way to close a chapter once its purpose had run its course? I don't think the evidence currently lets us choose between those answers with any confidence. What it does let us say, with more confidence than I expected when I first started reading the excavation reports, is that this wasn't carelessness, and it wasn't catastrophe. It was a decision, made deliberately and made again and again for as long as anyone kept building at all. I want to move the clock forward now, deliberately, not by centuries, by thousands of years. Skip past the Halaf period entirely, past the slow spread of farming villages across Mesopotamia, past the rise of the first walled towns and the slow accumulation of administrative record-keeping that eventually made writing necessary, until you reach the moment something genuinely new appears in the record, writing itself. The earliest cuneiform tablets emerge in southern Mesopotamia, in cities like Uruk, sometime around 3400 to 3100 BCE, roughly 5,000 years after the final layers at Göbekli Tepe were quietly backfilled and abandoned. The distance matters, and I think it's worth sitting with for a moment. This isn't a direct handoff between two neighbouring cultures who knew each other, traded with each other, or shared a recognisable continuous memory. It's a gap wide enough to swallow the entire span of recorded history that followed it, several times over. So what survived that gap, if anything did? When this newly literate culture finally writes about itself, what strikes me is how insistently it describes its own foundational knowledge as inherited rather than invented from nothing, passed down from somewhere or someone that came before it, rather than developed gradually from scratch by the people writing it down. The Sumerian king list, compiled centuries later but drawing on much older oral and written tradition, opens with a phrase that has puzzled and fascinated readers for as long as it's been translated. Kingship, it says, descended from heaven. Not earned through conquest, not built up gradually by ambitious local chieftains consolidating power over generations, handed down, fully formed, from somewhere outside ordinary human history, to a series of rulers in cities whose names, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, read today like fragments of something much older than the list itself, cities the Sumerians treated as belonging to a deep, half-legendary past rather than to living memory. Alongside the kings, there are the sages. Later Mesopotamian tradition, preserved in fragments and summarized centuries afterward by the Babylonian priest Berossus, describes 7 semi-divine beings, Apkallu in the original language, who emerged before a great flood to teach humanity the foundations of civilization, writing, agriculture, law, the building of cities and temples. The first and most prominent of them, sometimes called Oans in the Greek summary of Berossus's account, is described as emerging from the sea each day to instruct people in the arts of civilization, then withdrawing again at night, never fully settling among the population he was teaching. Other traditions name a figure called Adapa among these early sages, a wise man granted knowledge directly from the gods, but, notably, denied immortality in the end. Knowledge handed down, but never completely, never without something essential withheld or quietly lost along the way. These weren't gods exactly, and they weren't ordinary men. I think of them as something in between, remembered specifically as the bringers of civilization to people who, before they arrived, apparently had none of it. And then, running through nearly every version of this tradition, there's the flood. Not one flood among many, but the flood, a single catastrophic before and after line drawn across the world the Sumerians believed they had inherited. The Sumerian flood story, sometimes called the Eridu Genesis, and the later Babylonian Atrahasis tradition, both describe a deluge that ends an entire prior age. A king named Ziusudra, in the Sumerian version, survives it by building a boat on divine instruction. The same narrative core later echoed almost beat for beat in the flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Kingship existed before the flood. The sages taught before the flood. Then something happened. Afterward, the Sumerian king list itself simply restarts, its own text marking the moment with the words, "after the flood had swept over," as though the scribes recording it understood the break to be real, structural and total. History, in their own telling, had to begin again from a diminished position. I want to be precise about what I'm not claiming here, because it would be easy, at this point, to overreach. No Sumerian tablet names Göbekli Tepe. No cuneiform text describes T-shaped pillars in southeastern Turkey, or mentions Karahan Tepe, or identifies the specific builders who filled in their own monuments and walked away into whatever came next for them. There is no direct documentable line connecting one specific Neolithic site to one specific line in one specific Mesopotamian text, and there is no inscription anywhere that closes that 5,000-year gap with a name, a date, or a verifiable chain of transmission. Anyone claiming a literal, traceable link is claiming more than the evidence currently supports. What there is instead is a shape. A culture roughly 11,000 years ago that organised itself well enough to raise monumental architecture, maintained a consistent symbolic vocabulary across an entire region for centuries, and then, deliberately, buried what it built and left no individual name behind anywhere in the record. And a few thousand years later, the first literate culture in the same general part of the world insists, repeatedly across multiple independent texts compiled by different scribes in different cities, that its own foundational knowledge didn't originate with it. Builders without names, on one end of this broken trail, teachers without full names remembered only as roles on the other. That isn't a citation, and it was never going to be one. It's an echo, the kind that survives not as a fact transmitted accurately across millennia, but as a shape a story keeps returning to, told and retold long after the specific people, places and events that may have inspired it have been forgotten down to the last identifying detail. Civilizations that genuinely invent their own knowledge from nothing don't usually insist, this consistently and this specifically, that they didn't. I keep asking myself why a culture confident enough to build an empire, raise temples and codify law would still choose to tell itself that none of it was originally theirs. What does a civilization gain by insisting its kingship was a gift rather than an achievement? What does it gain by remembering its first teachers as outsiders, sea creatures, semi-divine wanderers, figures who taught and then withdrew rather than staying to rule? I don't think that's how a culture talks about itself if it simply invented its own foundations and forgot the invention. It's closer to how a culture talks when something real did come before it, fragmented and unverifiable, but persistent enough that erasing it from the story entirely never felt like an option. So where did they go? That's the question I started this whole investigation with, and I think it deserves an honest answer rather than a tidy one. The honest answer is that they probably didn't go anywhere. Not in the way the question implies. Nobody packed up and walked toward a single destination. There was no exodus, no single final march out of the Şanlıurfa hills toward some place we could point to on a map. What happened, as far as 11 excavated mounds and thousands of years of silence in between can tell me, was slower and far less cinematic than disappearance. The building stopped. The enclosures were filled in, deliberately, by people who clearly understood exactly what they were closing, even if that reasoning never made it down to us. And then, generation by generation, the population that had once carried this particular set of beliefs simply dispersed into smaller groups, adopted the slower rhythms of settled farming life, and stopped needing, or stopped being permitted, or simply stopped remembering how, to gather at the scale required to raise 10-ton pillars out of bedrock. The stones stayed. That part is almost too obvious to say out loud, but I think it matters more than it first appears. The only thing that survived fully intact across 11,000 years is the part nobody had to actively remember in order to preserve. Limestone doesn't require an oral tradition. It just sits in the ground, indifferent to all of it, until someone with a trowel and a research grant happens to find it again. Everything else, the names of the people who carved it, the words they used for what they believed, the precise reasons they chose burial over abandonment, needed a living chain of memory to survive that long. And that chain, at some unrecorded point along this broken trail, broke. It didn't break all at once. Memory rarely does. I think it's far more likely that the people who once gathered at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe scattered, over generations, into dozens of smaller, more dispersed communities, each one carrying a fragment of the whole rather than the complete picture. A ritual gesture preserved here, a half-remembered animal symbol there, a vague inherited sense that something important used to happen on that particular hill, without anyone left who could fully explain what, or why, or to whom it had mattered. Imagine for a moment someone 4,000 or 5,000 years after the last enclosure was backfilled, a herder, maybe, or an early farmer's daughter somewhere in the wider Mesopotamian world, listening to an elder describe a hill of standing stones that no one alive had ever seen. She wouldn't have known the word Göbekli Tepe. She wouldn't have known Karahan Tepe or the Taş Tepeler project, or any of the names archaeologists would eventually assign to it. She would only have inherited the shape of the story, that someone, long before her own people, knew how to build and gather and believe at a scale no one around her could explain. That fragment, carried forward by people like her, scattered and recombined 1,000 times over, is closer to what actually survived than any specific name ever could be. Scattered fragments don't transmit cleanly across that many generations. They drift, mutate, get reattached to newer stories, newer gods, newer explanations that make sense to people who no longer have access to the original context. By the time anything resembling a coherent story reemerges, thousands of years later, in a Sumerian scribe's careful cuneiform, the specific people involved have been gone long enough that only the shape of what they once represented survives. Not their names, not their language, not their actual reasons. Just the outline. Someone came before us, knew things we didn't invent ourselves, and then something ended. Is that a small thing to have survived 5,000 years of near-total silence? I don't think so. A name is fragile and fades fast without someone actively repeating it. A face is even more fragile, but the idea that civilization itself was a gift handed down from before, that kingship descended rather than was simply seized, that sages taught rather than people quietly figured it out alone, that idea apparently had enough structural weight to outlast every specific, verifiable detail that would have made it provable. It became myth precisely because myth is what reliably survives when the underlying facts don't. Later cultures didn't preserve Göbekli Tepe's actual builders as historical figures with biographies, because by the time anyone nearby was writing things down, there was no continuous history left to draw on directly, only a feeling, inherited and reshaped across centuries, that something foundational had happened well before anyone could write it down to check. So they became gods instead. They became sages with names like Oannes and Adapa, doing the same essential work the actual builders once did, teaching, building, organising belief into a durable form. I keep coming back to the 11 mounds because 11 is such a specific, almost mundane number for something this large in scope. 11 hills in one valley, holding what is currently the oldest deliberate ritual architecture anyone has found anywhere on Earth, most of them still barely touched by a trowel. Whatever else gets discovered in the seasons ahead, it's unlikely that any of it will produce a name. That isn't a flaw in the research. It's simply what happens to a culture that existed before writing existed to hold it accountable to memory. So, again, where did they go? They went into smaller groups, into farming villages, into traditions that no longer needed T-shaped pillars to feel coherent. They went eventually into myth. Not because myth is where truth goes to die, but because myth is sometimes the only vessel patient enough to carry something for 5,000 years without a name attached to it. The builders of Göbekli Tepe didn't vanish in a single day. They faded slowly and unevenly into the only kind of memory that survives when no one is left who remembers your actual name, the kind where you stop being a person and start being a god, a sage, or simply a story about someone who came before history began to keep track. The trail doesn't end. It just stops being a trail anyone can follow with a name attached.